March 15, 1944, 25,000 feet above the German countryside. The sky is impossibly blue, the kind of crystalline clarity that comes after winter storms have scrubbed the atmosphere clean. At this altitude, the air is thin and cold, 50 degrees below zero, and the cockpit of Oberleutnant Werner Hartmann's Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 rattles with the familiar vibration of a Daimler-Benz engine pushed to operational limits. He has been flying for 3 years now, has 47 confirmed kills painted in neat rows beneath his canopy, has survived the Eastern Front and the desperate skies over the Reich. He is 23 years old and he is tired, but he is also supremely confident in his machine, in his training, in the absolute superiority of German aviation technology. Below him, scattered across the frozen landscape, the contrails of a massive American bomber formation snake toward their target, probably Berlin, maybe Leipzig, it hardly matters anymore. The Americans come every day now when the weather permits, hundreds of heavy bombers in tight defensive boxes, their combined firepower capable of shredding any fighter that ventures too close. But they are slow, these flying fortresses and liberators, ponderous in their precision formations, and Werner knows how to attack them. You come from above and behind, diving through the formation at speeds that minimize your exposure to their guns. You fire your cannon into their engines and fuel tanks, and then you are gone, climbing away before their escorts can react. The escorts. That is the new problem. For 2 years, the Luftwaffe had owned the skies over Germany, had been able to intercept the American daylight, bombers with relative impunity, because the Americans had no fighters, with the range to accompany them deep into the Reich. The bombers' own guns provided some defense, but German pilots had learned to exploit the gaps, had developed tactics that turned each bombing mission into a gauntlet of terror for the American crews. The kill ratios had been acceptable, even favorable. Germany was losing the war on every front, but in the air the Luftwaffe could still claim a kind of victory. Then, 3 months ago, the escorts had appeared. At first, just a few, American fighters that somehow had the range to penetrate deep into Germany, to loiter over the target areas, to engage the Luftwaffe on terms that were suddenly, disturbingly equal. The intelligence reports had been confusing, contradictory. Some pilots reported a new type of American fighter, sleek and fast with a distinctive profile. Others insisted it was simply P-47 Thunderbolts with drop tanks, nothing to be particularly concerned about. Werner himself had not yet encountered these new escorts. He had heard the rumors, the whispered conversations in the pilot-ready rooms about Mustangs that could outrun and outturn anything in the German arsenal, but he had dismissed these as the exaggerations of rattled pilots, men whose nerves had been shattered by too many missions. Werner Hartmann does not have shattered nerves. Werner Hartmann is about to learn what happens when confidence meets reality at 400 miles per hour. He sees them now, perhaps 2 miles distant, flying top cover above the bomber stream. Even at this range, he can tell they are not Thunderbolts. The silhouette is wrong, too sleek, too elegant. They are flying in loose formations, not the tight swarm that German doctrine dictates, but with a casual spacing that suggests either incompetence or absolute confidence. Werner smiles inside his oxygen mask. Americans, cowboys playing at war. He clicks his radio transmitter, alerts his wingman, begins his approach vector. The plan is simple. Ignore the escorts, dive through to the bombers, make the kill, then use superior German engineering and training to disengage before the American fighters can respond. It is a good plan. It has worked 100 times before. It will not work today. Werner pushes his stick forward, feels the Messerschmitt respond instantly, diving toward the bomber formation with the acceleration that has made the 109 legendary. His airspeed indicator climbs 350, 400, 450 miles per hour. At this speed, he should be untouchable, should be able to make his attack and zoom back to altitude before any Allied fighter can react. He has his target selected, a B-17 on the edge of the formation, one engine already trailing smoke from earlier damage. An easy kill. And then the escort drops on him from above. Werner sees it in his peripheral vision, a flash of silver, impossibly fast, already inside his turn radius. His instincts take over, trained reflexes honed by 3 years of combat. He brakes hard right, pulls the stick back, feels the G-forces slam him into his seat as the Messerschmitt responds. He is good at this. has escaped more dangerous situations than he can count. The American will overshoot, will be unable to follow the tight turn, and Werner will reverse and suddenly the predator will become prey. Except the American does not overshoot. The silver fighter, and Werner can see now that it is indeed one of the rumored Mustangs. The American inline engine clearly visible, the distinctive bubble canopy glinting in the sunlight, stays with him through the turn. Not just stays with him, but closes the distance, positioning itself with a precision that Werner has only ever seen from the most experienced Luftwaffe aces. Tracer rounds snap past his canopy, bright and impossibly close. Werner reverses again, chops his throttle, tries every evasive maneuver he knows. The Mustang follows as if connected by an invisible wire. For the first time in 3 years of combat, Werner Hartmann experiences pure, undiluted fear. This is not how it is supposed to work. German fighters are superior. German pilots are superior. The Americans are numerous but clumsy, relying on overwhelming numbers rather than skill. This is what he has been taught, what he has believed, what the evidence of his 47 kills has seemed to confirm. The Mustang is still there, still closing. Werner firewalls his throttle, pushes the Daimler-Benz engine beyond its rated limits, dives for the ground trading altitude for speed. His airspeed indicator touches 500 miles per hour, the airframe shaking with the strain. Behind him the Mustang dives too, and Werner realizes with sick certainty that it is not just keeping pace, it is gaining. The American fighter, this machine that German intelligence had dismissed as improvised and inadequate, is faster than his Messerschmitt, not marginally faster but decisively, overwhelmingly faster. Werner jinks left, pulls up hard, tries to force an overshoot. The Mustang anticipates the move, cuts inside his turn. More tracers closer now, walking up his wing toward the cockpit. Werner knows he is beaten. He knows that in the next few seconds he will likely be dead. His name added to the growing list of Luftwaffe, pilots who have discovered too late that the air war has fundamentally changed. The rounds that tear through his right wing do not come from the Mustang, but from his wingman's guns, or what used to be his wingman before another Mustang shot him down and his fighter spiraled toward the frozen earth trailing fire. Werner sees this in the fragmentary way of aerial combat, in glimpses between his own desperate maneuvers. The sky that 3 minutes ago had seemed to belong to the Luftwaffe is now filled with silver American fighters, and they are hunting. Werner Hartmann jettisons his canopy, pulls the release handle, and punches out into the screaming wind. His parachute deploys, and as he drifts down toward the German countryside that his orders say he was defending, he watches the American fighters continue their work. They are not just defeating his fellow pilots, they are dominating them, outflying them, demonstrating a superiority so complete that it renders years of Luftwaffe confidence suddenly, shockingly absurd. He lands in a snow-covered field. He is alive. His hands are shaking. And as he gathers his parachute and begins the long walk to the nearest village, Werner Hartmann cannot stop thinking about those silver fighters, about the casual competence with which they had turned German air superiority into a memory, about what it means when the enemies you have been taught to despise prove themselves to be unquestionably, undeniably better than you. The architecture of arrogance to understand Werner Hartmann's shock, to comprehend the psychological earthquake that the P-51 Mustang represented for German pilots in 1944, we must first understand the world of absolute confidence that they had inhabited for nearly 5 years. The Luftwaffe in 1939 had been, by any objective measure, the finest air force in the world. It had been built from nothing after the Treaty of Versailles had banned Germany from possessing military aircraft, reconstructed in secret and then openly after Hitler repudiated the treaty, and by the time war began it represented the cutting edge of aviation technology and tactical doctrine. German aircraft were genuinely superior to their opponents in the war's early years. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, introduced in 1937, was faster, better armed, and more maneuverable than the British Hurricanes and French Morane Sauniers it faced in 1940. German pilots, many of whom had gained combat experience during the Spanish Civil War, were more experienced and better trained than their Allied counterparts. German tactical doctrine built around the loose four-aircraft swarm formation, rather than the rigid Vic of 3 that the British used, was demonstrably more effective in combat. When the Luftwaffe swept across Poland and France, when it dominated the skies over the Balkans and North Africa, these advantages were not propaganda but observable reality. Even the Battle of Britain, which ended in strategic defeat for Germany, had not seriously challenged the technical superiority of German aviation. The Luftwaffe had lost because of strategic errors, poor targeting decisions, the diversion of effort from airfields to cities, the impossibility of maintaining air operations across the Channel without forward bases. But in individual combat, the 109 had proven itself at least equal to the legendary Spitfire and decisively superior to the Hurricane. German pilots who survived the Battle of Britain did not question their aircraft or their training. They questioned their leadership, their strategy, but not their fundamental technical superiority. This confidence was reinforced by the catastrophic early performance of American aviation. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, its air forces were equipped with aircraft that were, charitably, mediocre. The P-40 Warhawk that equipped most U.S. fighter squadrons was slower than the Bf-109, less maneuverable, and inadequately armed. The P-39 Airacobra, another American fighter sent to Europe in small numbers, was so poor that the RAF refused to use it operationally, relegating it to training duties. The Americans eventually sent most of their Airacobras to the Soviet Union as Lend-Lease equipment, where Russian pilots learned to make use of its low-altitude performance, but acknowledged its serious deficiencies. When American bombers began their daylight strategic bombing campaign in 1942, German pilots viewed them as target practice. The American bombers were impressive. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a magnificent aircraft, capable of absorbing tremendous damage and still returning home. But they were slow, and their fighter escorts in 1942 and 1943 consisted of P-47 Thunderbolts that, while tough and powerful, lacked the range to accompany the bombers deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe developed tactics specifically for bomber interception. Attack from head-on, where the bomber's defensive armament was weakest, or dive through the formation from above at high speed. Make your pass, and climb away before the escorts could react. These tactics were effective. American bomber losses in 1943 were catastrophic. The raid on Schweinfurt in October 1943 saw 60 B-17s shot down out of 291 dispatched, a loss rate of more than 20%. At such rates, no air campaign could be sustained. American bomber crews calculated their survival odds and found them grim. The probability of surviving a full 25-mission tour was approximately 25%. The Luftwaffe was winning the air war over Germany through simple mathematics. They were destroying bombers faster than the Americans could replace them and train new crews. This success bred a dangerous complacency. German pilots in late 1943 knew they were losing the overall war. The Eastern Front was a catastrophe. North Africa had been lost. Italy had surrendered. But in the air over the Reich, they were still superior. American pilots were brave but poorly trained, flying in tight formations that limited their maneuverability. American aircraft were rugged but uninspired, designed by engineers who valued mass production over performance. This was the narrative that German pilots told themselves, that their intelligence officers confirmed, that their victories seemed to prove. And then the P-51 Mustang arrived in numbers, and the narrative collapsed. The unlikely revolution, the P-51 Mustang was not supposed to be an exceptional aircraft. Its origin story reads like a series of accidents and improvisations, rather than deliberate design genius. In April 1940, with Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany and desperately short of fighter aircraft, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation with a request to build P-40 fighters under license for the RAF. North American Aviation, a relatively small company with limited fighter experience, made a counter-proposal. Instead of building an obsolete design, they would create a completely new fighter aircraft, and they would do it in 120 days. It was an audacious promise bordering on reckless. Fighter aircraft development typically took years, not months. But North American Aviation had an ace designer named Edgar Schmued, a German-American engineer who had studied European aviation developments and had clear ideas about what made a great fighter. Schmued's team worked around the clock, and in October 1940, just 102 days after receiving the British contract, the prototype NA-73X was rolled out for testing. The early Mustangs were good aircraft but not exceptional. Powered by Allison V-1710 engines, They had excellent low-altitude performance, but suffered at the high altitudes where air combat increasingly took place. The RAF used them primarily for ground attack and reconnaissance missions, roles where their speed and range were valuable, but their altitude limitations were less critical. American forces showed limited interest. The Mustang seemed destined to be a footnote, a capable but not outstanding aircraft that filled a secondary role while the real air war was fought by Spitfires and Thunderbolts and Messerschmitts. The transformation came from an almost offhand suggestion by a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker. In April 1942, Harker flew an Allison-powered Mustang and immediately recognized its potential. The airframe was superb, aerodynamically clean, structurally sound, with excellent handling characteristics. The problem was simply the engine. Harker suggested that North American aviation mate the Mustang airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the legendary Spitfire. The result was extraordinary. The Merlin-powered P-51B, which entered service in late 1943, was transformed from a good aircraft into arguably the finest piston engine fighter ever built. It was fast. At 440 miles per hour at altitude, it was as fast or faster than any fighter in service. It was maneuverable, capable of turning with the lighter BF-109 and FW-190. It had range, extraordinary range, especially when fitted with drop tanks. It could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something no other Allied fighter could do, and it was available in quantity, rolling off American production lines at rates that German industry, devastated by Allied bombing and starved for resources, could not hope to match. The P-51D, introduced in early 1944 with a bubble canopy that gave the pilot unobstructed visibility, represented the pinnacle of piston engine fighter development. Every aspect of the aircraft was optimized for air combat. The laminar flow wing design reduced drag and increased speed. The armament of 650 caliber machine guns provided devastating firepower. The cockpit layout was logical and ergonomic, allowing pilots to focus on fighting rather than wrestling with their controls. Even small details mattered. The gun sight was gyroscopic and computing, automatically calculating lead angles for deflection shots, giving American pilots a technological advantage in the split-second decisions of air combat. But specifications alone do not explain the Mustang's impact. On paper, it was somewhat faster than the BF-109G, roughly equal in climb rate, similar in armament. The real advantage lay in the combination of range and performance. For the first time, American fighters could penetrate deep into Germany, could stay over the target area for extended periods, could hunt for German fighters rather than simply reacting to their attacks. The strategic situation shifted from defense to offense. German fighters, which had previously been able to choose when and how to engage, now had to fight whenever they rose to intercept the bombers, because the Mustangs were there waiting. The transformation of air combat, arrival of the P-51 Mustang in numbers, and in numbers, is crucial here, fundamentally altered the nature of the air war over Europe. In December 1943, American fighters flew 5,290 sorties over Germany. By March 1944, that number had increased to 17,648 sorties, and increasingly, these sorties were flown by Mustangs, ranging deep into the Reich, escorting bombers to their targets and back, and hunting for German fighters. The statistics are stark. In January 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 189 bombers. By May 1944, despite flying more missions against more heavily defended targets, losses had dropped to 130 bombers. The loss rate per sortie plummeted from 4.8% in January to 1.6% in May. This was not because German anti-aircraft defenses had weakened. They had actually strengthened. It was not because German pilots had become less skilled. Many were veterans with hundreds of combat hours. The difference was the Mustang, flying escort, maintaining air superiority, turning the skies over Germany from contested space into American-controlled territory. For German pilots, the experience was disorienting and demoralizing. Luftwaffe veterans who had survived years of combat against capable opponents, British Spitfires, Soviet Yak-9s, found themselves consistently outperformed by American pilots who often had far less experience. The problem was not courage or skill but simple mathematics. When a Mustang pilot could choose whether to engage or disengage, could run down any German fighter attempting to escape, could rely on superior high-altitude performance and virtually unlimited fuel, the outcome of individual combats was increasingly predetermined. German pilot accounts from this period make for painful reading. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, a Luftwaffe ace with 33 confirmed kills, wrote in his diary in March 1944, "The new American fighters are giving us serious problems. They are faster than our machines, they can fight at any altitude, and there are so many of them. We shoot down 2 and 4 appear. We destroy a squadron and a group replaces it. Where do they all come from?" The question was rhetorical but genuine. Where did they all come from? The answer lay in American industrial capacity, that same overwhelming productive power that German strategists had dismissed as irrelevant in a short war, but which now, in year 5 of the conflict, was proving decisive. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 14,059 P-51 Mustangs. By comparison, Germany in 1944 produced approximately 25,000 fighters of all types, a number that seems impressive until you realize that Germany was simultaneously fighting on multiple fronts, facing not just American production, but British and Soviet production as well. The numbers were crushing, but numbers alone do not fully explain the psychological impact. What demoralized German pilots was not just that they were being defeated, but how they were being defeated. These were American pilots, members of the nation that German propaganda had consistently portrayed as decadent, undisciplined, incapable of matching German martial excellence. And yet here they were, flying aircraft that were demonstrably superior, executing tactics that were innovative and effective, achieving air superiority through a combination of technology, training, and sheer overwhelming presence. The individual. Experienced Werner Hartmann, the pilot we left floating down in his parachute over Germany, survived the war. He survived by being grounded in May 1944, after his third encounter with American Mustangs left him with injuries severe enough that he was assigned to training duties. He spent the last year of the war teaching young pilots how to fight, knowing, even as he instructed them, that most would not survive their first 5 missions, knowing that the tactics he taught them were increasingly obsolete in the face of Allied air superiority. After the war, in a long interview conducted by American military historians in 1953, Werner spoke at length about his experiences. The transcript makes for fascinating reading. He was remarkably candid, perhaps because enough time had passed, that his ego could acknowledge what his younger self had been unable to accept, that the Mustang had not just been a better aircraft than the Bf-109, but had represented an entirely different philosophy of warfare. "We were taught," Werner said, "that war was about will, that superior will, superior discipline, superior racial qualities would overcome material disadvantage. This was the core of our doctrine, you understand? The Führer spoke often of the triumph of will. We believed that one German, properly motivated and trained, was worth 10 enemies. And for a time this seemed to be true. We had defeated the French, who had more tanks than we did. We had nearly defeated the British, who had more aircraft than we did. Willpower and superior tactics had overcome material disadvantage. But then we encountered the Americans in the air, and we discovered that they had will and material superiority. The Mustang pilot who shot me down, I never learned his name. He was not just flying a better aircraft. He was well-trained, aggressive, confident, and behind him were 100 more just like him, and behind them 1,000 more, and behind them an industrial system that could produce aircraft faster than we could destroy them. This was a type of warfare we did not understand, could not counter. We were taught to think about individual combat, about the ace and his personal skill. The Americans thought about systems, about production rates, about training pipelines. They built an air force the way they built automobiles, on assembly, lines in vast numbers, with interchangeable parts and standardized training. This insight that the Mustang represented not just technical superiority, but a fundamentally different approach to warfare, was something that many German pilots came to understand only in retrospect. In the moment, in 1944, all they knew was that the sky had suddenly become more dangerous than it had ever been, that aircraft they had expected to outperform were outperforming them, that American pilots they had been taught to despise were consistently defeating them in combat. The psychological toll was immense. Luftwaffe pilot losses in 1944 were catastrophic. Approximately 3,000 fighter pilots were killed in combat that year, and another 2,500 were seriously wounded or captured. Given that the Luftwaffe had only about 2,500 operational fighter pilots at the beginning of 1944, these losses meant that the average pilot's life expectancy, measured from the point of completing training and arriving at an operational unit, was measured in weeks, not months. New pilots were being sent into combat with minimal training, as little as 30 hours of flight time, compared to the 200-300 hours that had been standard earlier in the war. These poorly trained pilots, flying aircraft that were increasingly obsolete, facing American pilots in superior machines, died in numbers that bordered on massacre. The engineering behind the myth to truly understand why the P-51 Mustang was so effective, we need to look beyond performance specifications and examine the details of its design, the small choices that accumulated into overwhelming advantage. The Mustang was not a miracle. It was an engineered solution to specific problems, designed by people who understood both the physics of flight and the practical realities of air combat. Start with the engine. The Packard V1650, the American-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, produced 1,490 horsepower at war emergency power. This was comparable to the Daimler-Benz DB605 engine in the Bf109G, which produced about 475 horsepower. But the Packard Merlin maintained its power to much higher altitudes thanks to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. At 25,000 feet, where much of the air combat over Germany took place, the Mustang had a significant power advantage over the 109. This translated directly into speed and climb rate. The Mustang could outrun the 109 in level flight, and could climb away if a fight turned disadvantageous. The Mustang's range came from its aerodynamic efficiency and fuel capacity. The laminar flow, wing design developed by North American Aviation, reduced drag significantly compared to conventional wings. This meant the Mustang could fly farther on the same amount of fuel, or faster for the same fuel consumption. Combined with internal fuel tanks that held 269 gallons, later increased to 384 gallons with fuselage tanks, and external drop tanks that added another 110 to 150 gallons, the Mustang could escort bombers for missions lasting up to 6 hours, an endurance that would have been considered impossible for a single-seat fighter before the Mustang proved it feasible. The armament was pragmatic rather than overwhelming. 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, firing at a combined rate of about 4,200 rounds per minute. German fighters of the same era typically carried a mix of machine guns and 20mm or 30mm cannons, with the cannons offering more destructive power per hit, but at the cost of reduced ammunition capacity and slower rate of fire. The American approach, a large volume of accurate fire from high-velocity machine guns, proved devastatingly effective in practice. The 50 caliber round had enough kinetic energy to penetrate German aircraft armor and destroy critical systems, and American pilots trained extensively in marksmanship, learning to lead their targets accurately and fire in short, precise bursts. But perhaps the most crucial design element was the bubble canopy introduced in the P-51D model. This 360-degree clear canopy gave the pilot unobstructed visibility in all directions, including behind and above. In air combat, where the pilot who sees his enemy first usually wins, this was an enormous advantage. German fighters of the same era, including the Bf109 and FW190, had canopy designs that included metal framing and limited rearward visibility. Luftwaffe pilots had to constantly crane their necks, checking their 6 o'clock position, and even then they had blind spots. Mustang pilots could see everything, could track multiple enemies simultaneously, could spot attacks developing before they became critical. These advantages, power at altitude, range, effective armament, visibility, combined to create an aircraft that was extraordinarily forgiving of pilot error and extraordinarily punishing of enemy mistakes. A novice pilot in a Mustang had a reasonable chance of survival. A novice pilot in a Bf109 facing Mustangs had virtually none. The strategic cascade. The Mustang's impact extended far beyond individual aerial combats. Its arrival in numbers triggered a strategic cascade that fundamentally altered the course of the air war and, by extension, the ground war. Before the Mustang, the American daylight bombing campaign was in crisis. Losses were unsustainable, accuracy was poor, and there was genuine discussion in Allied command about whether the entire strategy of strategic bombing should be abandoned. The British had largely given up on daylight raids in 1940, switching to night bombing after suffering unacceptable losses to German fighters. By late 1943, it seemed possible that the Americans would be forced to follow the same path. The Mustang saved the daylight bombing campaign. With effective fighter escort all the way to the target and back, bomber losses dropped to sustainable levels. This allowed the Americans to maintain pressure on German industry, to systematically destroy oil refineries and aircraft production facilities, to grind down the German war economy through relentless attrition. By mid-1944, German aircraft production was in crisis not because factories had been destroyed. Many were dispersed to underground facilities that were difficult to bomb, but because the supply chain for critical materials had been disrupted, because trained workers had been killed or forced into military service, because the entire industrial system was collapsing under the weight of sustained Allied bombing. More importantly, the presence of long-range fighters forced a fundamental change in German air defense strategy. Before the Mustang, Luftwaffe fighters could afford to be selective, attacking only when conditions were favorable, retreating when faced with heavy opposition, conserving their forces for another day. The Mustang ended this luxury. German fighters had to engage, had to contest every Allied raid, because the alternative was allowing American bombers to destroy German cities and industries unopposed. But engaging meant fighting on American terms, accepting combat against fighters that were superior in nearly every metric, suffering losses that could not be replaced. The Luftwaffe was forced into a death spiral. They took heavy losses, which reduced their experienced pilot corps, which meant new pilots had to be rushed through training with inadequate preparation, which led to even heavier losses when these poorly trained pilots faced combat. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was effectively finished as a fighting force. They still had aircraft. German factories produced fighters until the very end of the war, but they lacked fuel to fly them and pilots capable of using them effectively. The last major Luftwaffe operation, the ground attack in support of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, was a disaster. Of the 300 aircraft committed, more than 100 were shot down, many by P-51 Mustangs that had complete air superiority. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Allies flew 14,000 sorties over the invasion beaches. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300. This was not because they lacked aircraft in absolute terms. There were thousands of German aircraft scattered across Europe, but because they could not concentrate them where they were needed without being intercepted and destroyed by Allied fighters, primarily Mustangs. The air superiority that made the Normandy invasion possible, that allowed Allied troops to advance with minimal interference from German aircraft, that permitted Allied tactical bombers to interdict German reinforcements, was built on the foundation of the P-51 Mustang's dominance of European skies. The symbolic weight of silver for German pilots, the Mustang became more than just an aircraft. It became a symbol, a physical manifestation of the American system they had been taught to despise but which was now demonstrating its superiority in the most visceral way possible. The bright aluminum finish of the P-51, left unpainted in many cases to save weight and reduce maintenance, made it distinctive and unmistakable. German pilots called them silver birds, and the name carried layers of meaning, beauty, danger, inevitability. The bare metal finish was itself a statement. German aircraft by 1944 were painted in elaborate camouflage schemes, designed to make them difficult to spot against the ground or sky. This was defensive thinking, the strategy of a force trying to survive. American aircraft, silver and gleaming, made no attempt at camouflage. They did not need to hide. They controlled the sky so completely that visibility was irrelevant. The silver skin said, "We are here, we own this space, and there is nothing you can do about it." Werner Hartmann spoke about this in his post-war interview. You would see them coming from 20 kilometers away, these silver formations so bright they hurt your eyes in the sun. And you knew what was going to happen. You knew you had to engage, had to try to stop them from escorting the bombers. And you knew that many of your friends would not return from this mission. The silver was like a mirror, showing us our own helplessness. We were reduced to fighting for survival, while they flew with the confidence of absolute superiority. This psychological dimension, the demoralization, that came from being consistently defeated by an enemy you had been taught to view as inferior, cannot be quantified in combat, reports or law statistics, but it was real and it mattered. Morale is a multiplier in warfare. High morale allows soldiers to endure hardship, to take risks, to maintain cohesion under pressure. Low morale degrades performance, increases desertion, makes units unreliable. By late 1944, Luftwaffe morale was shattered. Pilots reported sick to avoid missions, manufactured technical problems with their aircraft, in some cases simply refused orders. The spirit had been broken, not just by the material superiority of the Allies, but by the realization that the entire ideological framework they had built their lives around was demonstrably false. The Mustang represented American industrial capitalism in its purest form: efficient, abundant, technologically sophisticated, and relentlessly practical. It was designed not by inspired genius, but by methodical engineering, not as a masterwork, but as a product, and it was produced not in small numbers by craftsmen, but in vast quantities by assembly line workers, many of them women, using standardized parts and mass production techniques. Everything about the Mustang contradicted Nazi ideology about racial superiority and the triumph of will. It was the product of a multiracial democracy, designed by immigrant engineers, built by workers who were paid wages rather than motivated by ideology, and it was crushing the forces of National Socialism through simple, brutal efficiency. The accounting of war. The numbers tell their own story. By the end of the war in Europe, the 8th Air Force alone credited its P-51 Mustangs with 4,050 aerial victories, the highest total for any American fighter type in the European theater. When you add in the Mustangs flown by the 9th Air Force, the 15th Air Force in Italy, and those operated by the RAF, the total aerial victory credits exceed 7,000. These numbers are subject to the usual caveats about overclaiming. All sides in World War II credited more victories than enemy losses confirm, a natural result of the chaos of air combat, where multiple pilots might claim the same kill. But even accounting for overclaiming, the Mustang's kill ratio was extraordinary, especially when you consider that it was often flown by pilots with minimal combat experience against Luftwaffe veterans. The cost of this success was not trivial. The 8th Air Force alone lost 2,520 P-51s to all causes during the war: combat, accidents, weather, mechanical failure. Each of these losses represented not just an aircraft, but a trained pilot, a human being whose skills and life were invested in the air campaign. American casualty rates in the air war over Europe were severe. Of the roughly 350,000 Americans who served in the 8th Air Force, 26,000 were killed, and another 28,000 were captured or interned. These are casualty rates comparable to the infantry, achieved in an environment where technology was supposed to provide some protection. But American losses, while significant in absolute terms, were sustainable. The training pipeline continued to function throughout the war, producing new pilots faster than combat consumed them. Aircraft production never faltered. If anything, it accelerated. By 1945, American factories were producing aircraft faster than the military could absorb them, leading to thousands of fighters being placed directly into storage after manufacture. This abundance, this capacity to absorb losses and continue operating, was something Germany could not match. Every aircraft lost was one that could be replaced only with difficulty. Every experienced pilot killed represented an irreplaceable loss of expertise. The mathematics of attrition inexorably favored the Allies. German pilots understood this. They could see it in the growing numbers of American aircraft, in the declining quality of their own replacement pilots, in the increasingly desperate orders from high command. Unteroffizier Hans-Joachim Weisse, a Luftwaffe pilot with 23 kills, wrote in a letter to his family in March 1945, "We are losing this war in the air not because we lack courage or skill, but because we cannot replace what we lose and the enemy can. Each day there are fewer of us and more of them. It is simple arithmetic, and the sum is our defeat." The post-war reckoning, When the war ended in May 1945, Werner Hartmann was 24 years old, unemployed, and living in the ruins of what had been Germany. The Luftwaffe had been disbanded, its aircraft seized or destroyed, its pilots returned to civilian life with no marketable skills beyond their ability to fly machines that no longer existed. Werner had no job, no prospects, and a country that was occupied, divided, and devastated. He also had a profound sense of having been lied to. In the years after the war, as the full scope of Nazi crimes became undeniable, as the economic miracle of West Germany's recovery demonstrated what could be achieved through democracy and market economics, Werner came to understand that the Mustang had been teaching him a lesson that he had been too indoctrinated to learn in real time. That systems matter more than individuals, that abundance defeats scarcity, that open societies can outproduce and out-innovate closed ones. In 1952, Werner emigrated to the United States under a program that allowed German aviation specialists to resettle. He found work with Douglas Aircraft in California, contributing to the design of jet fighters that would face Soviet MiGs in Korea. The irony was not lost on him, that he was now working for the nation whose aircraft had defeated him, building machines that incorporated lessons from the Mustang that had shot him down. But it felt right in a way that his wartime service never had. He was contributing to creation rather than destruction, was building rather than tearing down. In his California workshop, Werner kept a photograph of a P-51 Mustang, pristine in its silver finish, taken at an air show in the 1950s. When colleagues asked about it, he would tell them about March 15, 1944, about the moment when his understanding of the world had been shattered at 25,000 feet above Germany. He would tell them about floating down in his parachute, watching silver fighters dominate the sky, understanding for the first time that everything he had believed was wrong. That aircraft, he would say, pointing at the photograph, taught me that reality does not care about ideology. You can believe with perfect faith that you are superior, that your cause is just, that will and discipline will overcome material disadvantage. But reality does not care what you believe. Reality is equations and engineering and industrial capacity. The Mustang was reality, and reality defeated us. The engineering of freedom, the P-51 Mustang continued to serve long after World War II ended. It flew in Korea, where it was used primarily for ground attack missions, the days of large-scale dogfights having passed with the advent of jet aircraft. It served in the air forces of dozens of nations, from Israel to Australia, from Sweden to Indonesia. Many remained in service into the 1980s, a testament to the soundness of their basic design. Some fly still, lovingly maintained by collectors and warbird enthusiasts, appearing at air shows where they perform aerobatics that demonstrate capabilities that once made them masters of the sky. But the Mustang's real legacy is not measured in years of service or numbers produced. Its legacy is strategic and ideological. The Mustang proved that democratic societies could produce military technology equal or superior to totalitarian states, that freedom and innovation were complementary rather than contradictory, that the open exchange of ideas and the profit motive of capitalism could generate solutions that centralized planning could not match. Consider the Mustang's development timeline. From initial concept to operational deployment took less than 3 years. This was achieved not through government decree or centralized planning, but through collaboration between private companies, military requirements officers, and innovative engineers. North American aviation was motivated by profit and reputation. Packard Motors saw an opportunity to demonstrate their manufacturing capabilities. The U.S. Army Air Forces wanted the best possible fighter. These interests aligned, and the result was one of the finest aircraft of the war. Contrast this with German aircraft development in the same period, which was plagued by political interference, competing fiefdoms within the Nazi bureaucracy, and irrational decisions made for ideological rather than practical reasons. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, could have entered service a year earlier if development had not been repeatedly disrupted by Hitler's insistence that it be modified into a bomber. The Heinkel He-280, another jet fighter that showed tremendous promise, was canceled in favor of the Me-262, largely because of political rivalry between aircraft manufacturers and their patrons within the Nazi hierarchy. The Mustang succeeded, because it was developed in a system that rewarded innovation and penalized failure through market mechanisms rather than political decree. Companies that produced superior designs won contracts. Engineers who solved problems were promoted. Pilots provided feedback that was actually incorporated into design improvements. This iterative process, driven by practical concerns rather than ideology, produced aircraft that worked. The measurement of systems if we step back from the individual stories. From Werner Hartmann's terror as he was shot down and the grinding statistics of kill ratios and production numbers, we can see the P-51 Mustang as a symbol of something larger. The contest between different ways of organizing human society, different theories about what motivates human excellence, different beliefs about the relationship between the individual and the collective. Nazi ideology held that hierarchy and discipline were the keys to human achievement, that people needed to be organized under strong leadership, subordinated to collective purposes, motivated by a combination of ideological fervor and fear. The Soviet system, while ideologically opposite to Nazism in many ways, shared this basic assumption about the necessity of central control and collective purpose. The defining struggle of the 20th century was between these totalitarian systems and the democratic capitalism of the West. The Mustang, in its silver perfection, made an argument for the Western system. It demonstrated that you could achieve excellence without dictatorship, innovation without central planning, military effectiveness without totalitarian control. The pilots who flew it were volunteers, motivated by patriotism certainly, but serving in a military that respected their individuality, that rotated them home after completing their missions, that treated them as citizens temporarily in uniform, rather than as permanent instruments of state power. The workers who built it were paid employees, free to quit if they found better opportunities, protected by unions, working in factories that competed for government contracts by producing superior products. This is not to romanticize the American system of 1944, which had its own deep flaws and contradictions. Racial segregation was official policy in the U.S. military and throughout much of American society. Japanese Americans were held in internment camps. Workers faced exploitation and dangerous conditions. The system was far from perfect, but it was a system that contained within it the mechanisms for self-correction, for improvement, for responding to criticism and incorporating new ideas. And in the crucible of total war, it proved capable of outproducing and out-innovating its totalitarian opponents. The Mustang was evidence of this capability, physical proof that the open society could compete and win. Epilogue. The Testament of Silver. There is a museum in Dayton, Ohio, at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, where a P-51D Mustang hangs suspended from the ceiling, frozen in eternal flight. Its aluminum skin is polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the faces of visitors who stand beneath it and look up. Children point and ask questions. Veterans pause and remember. The aircraft is silent, its Packard Merlin engine cold and still, but it speaks nonetheless. It speaks of a moment in history when the outcome of civilization hung in the balance, when the question of how humans should organize themselves was being decided not in philosophical debates, but in the skies over Europe at 400 miles per hour. It speaks of the men who designed it, who built it, who flew it, who were defeated by it. It speaks of abundance over scarcity, of openness over control, of the power of systems that trust individuals to exceed expectations rather than forcing them to meet quotas. Werner Hartmann never visited that museum, though he thought about it. He died in 1989 in California, surrounded by family, having lived long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall and the Cold War end with the same system's victory that the Mustang had represented in 1944. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service in the Luftwaffe, but focused primarily on his contributions to American aviation, on the fighter aircraft he had helped design, on his role in building the very air superiority that had once been used against him. His grandson found, among his effects, the photograph of the Mustang that Werner had kept in his workshop, and on the back, in Werner's handwriting, a single sentence in German. This is what defeat looks like: beautiful, fast, and absolutely certain. It was not bitterness that motivated this inscription, but something closer to admiration, even gratitude. The Mustang had defeated Werner Hartmann, had destroyed the world he had known and believed in. But in doing so, it had freed him from an ideology that would have led only to destruction, had opened his eyes to a larger world of possibility, had given him the chance to build rather than destroy, to create rather than conquer. The silver finish of the P-51 Mustang was not camouflage but statement. It said, "We have nothing to hide, nothing to fear, nothing to apologize for. We are here in the open, visible and vulnerable, and we are still superior." This is the confidence of abundance, the security of systems that work, the assurance that comes from knowing that your society's foundations are sound. German pilots laughed at rusty planes, at American industrial products, at the cowboys and factory workers who dared to challenge the master race in aerial combat. They laughed until the silver fighters appeared in their skies, until the Mustangs outran and outfought everything the Luftwaffe could field, until the laughter died in the recognition that superiority was not about ideology or will, but about reality, cold, hard, and undeniable. The Mustang taught this lesson at terrible cost, in fire and falling aircraft, in parachutes blossoming over frozen fields, in widows and orphans and shattered lives. But it was a lesson that needed teaching, a truth that needed demonstrating. Freedom works. Abundance is possible. Open societies, for all their flaws and contradictions, can outperform closed ones. These are not comfortable truths for those who have built their lives around different assumptions, but they are truths nonetheless. And in the sky over museums, in the roar of restored engines at air shows, in the photographs and memories and stories that persist long after the pilots have gone, the silver fighters fly still, eternal testimony to the power of human ingenuity when married to human freedom, to what becomes possible when systems trust individuals to be excellent, to the simple fact that reality always wins in the end. The Mustang was not just an aircraft. It was an argument, made in aluminum and steel, proven in combat, validated by history, and the argument was this: that the open hand builds better than the closed fist, that abundance defeats scarcity, that the future belongs not to those who demand the most sacrifice, but to those who enable the most possibility. German pilots laughed at American planes until the laughter stopped, replaced by understanding too late, too costly, but nonetheless real. The silver fighters taught them what they had refused to learn from books and speeches and reason: that freedom works, that democracy delivers, that the future belongs to those who build rather than those who conquer. And that lesson, purchased at such terrible price, flies still in the silent testimony of silver wings catching the sun.